For those of you who are less familiar, Congress is divided, the members of Congress serve on committees, and the committees each specialize in different areas. There are certain committees that have priority over these issues that you all are coming to talk about. So on the House side, you've got Energy and Commerce Committee. I know Cheryl and I are both probably a little bit partial to that committee. We think it's the best committee. But the other committees are also important. The Ways and Means Committee, which generally in the healthcare space has jurisdiction over Medicare, Medicaid, and the Appropriations Committee, which our colleague from Research America just gave you a thorough rundown of. On the Senate side, you've got the Help Committee, the Finance Committee, and the Appropriations Committee. And those are the six primary committees of jurisdiction over healthcare issues. So the things that you guys are going to be lobbying on, members who serve on those committees tend to focus on. Now, if your member of Congress does not sit on one of those six committees, he is not at all important. Just kidding. He or she, they're just as important in the legislative process because they can serve as strong advocates, strong voices in sharing the constituent perspective on these issues, just the same that a member who serves on those committees of jurisdiction can. They just don't get the first dibs on those issues. The committees of jurisdiction get to hear the issues first. They kind of start the crafting process of the legislation, and then once legislation moves to the floor, then members who don't serve on those committees are able to offer amendments and certainly can weigh in with votes and speeches and can also serve as co-sponsors to the legislation, that whether or not they serve on the committee. So I served for a member of Congress from Brooklyn, New York. Anybody from New York in here? Yeah, New York. I'm not from there originally, but I was kind of adopted by the district. And he served in Congress for 30 years before he retired in 2012. And I worked with him for his last 4.5 years in office. So I worked in his personal office at first as an unpaid intern, then as a legislative assistant. I handled 13 different issues, totally unrelated. At that point, I didn't even have healthcare as in my issue portfolio. And then I also, once he became committee chair of the House Oversight and Government Reform Committee, I served on his committee staff as committee counsel. And then when the Democrats lost the House in 2010, went back up to the personal office, served as legislative director, and helped to shape his legislative agenda for the remaining 2 years in office that he served. At that point, I handled his healthcare portfolio, and I staffed him on the Energy and Commerce Committee, where he actively worked on PDUFA. If some of you might remember lobbying on the FAST Act in 2012. That was a bill that Congressman Towns was very engaged in. So I was, very happy to lend a voice. And, Congressman Towns, just kind of a quick personal story to share from my time with him. He is, if I ever said was, he would get very upset. He is a social worker, and he came to Congress as a social worker. So he really cares a lot about people and about doing the right thing. And he was a legislator and policymaker, but a social worker first. And the lens that he viewed congressional action through was the lens of a social worker. And I had talked to him about the FAST Act, and I had told him, I think this is a really good issue for you to take a leadership role in. And I explained to him the policy and why he should support accelerated approval and all this. And he was like, yeah, this sounds good, this sounds good. And then maybe a week or two later, he went back home to the district, and somebody, maybe who's in this room, met with him in the district to talk about their story and why rare disease issues matter to them. And he came back and he said, hey, Emily, I don't know if we're doing anything in the rare disease space, but I really think we ought to. And I was like, sir, you're already leading this bill that we've talked about. So he, it really became real to him once an advocate explained to him why accelerated approval matters. So this is why your stories matter, sharing your stories with members of Congress matter. I want to pause for a second, let Cheryl talk a bit, and then we can kind of go into election year stuff.
I just wanted to start off by saying that it is a privilege to be with you all again today, the power of this organization to bring voices together in a very cohesive way on very distinct diseases that are rare and have an impact on the Hill has been so impressive to me, especially over the past few years. And it's truly a privilege to work with you all this morning and hopefully give, for those of y'all who is your first time, thank you, Emily, for that exercise, for your first time on the Hill, a little bit of a better perspective of how to have a really great meeting with your time that you're dedicating to these causes today. I worked on the Hill for over 15 years. In fact, I caught the political bug and wanted to change the world and thought government was the way to go, and I still think it is. And that's Republican perspective. I think you, in order to change what you don't like in your democracy, that being a part of the process is a better way to go about it. And so I actually did not start in the healthcare policy space. I was asked at the time for a member of Energy and Commerce, would I be willing to work on the healthcare policy portfolio, healthcare portfolio, and I said, sure, I can work on that. It's related to these other issues that I was interested in. And sure enough, the folks that you meet with in a personal office, the patient advocates that come in, even though every group has its distinct issue or concern, there are overarching policy issues that for the folks in DC who really, it's theory first in DC, and when you're lucky, you have personal experience with some of the members, right? But for the vast majority of people who are working on many of these policy issues, it's theory. And when you meet with a lot of different patient advocates, you start to see a thread that weaves a more cohesive story. And I think for you all today, what I hope you will find when you go to the Hill is that there will be some staffers that really click with what you say. And those staffers hopefully have the relationship with their boss, just as Emily explained that she did with her boss, and what I absolutely had with all of my bosses on the Hill, where you could go to them and say, this policy issue was raised to me today. I've been hearing about this issue also in a series of other issues, and what if we pursued a policy path forward in this space? And I think that is the result that you all don't necessarily see when you first come to a Capitol Hill meeting and you meet with a staffer that lasts much longer after your visit. So thank you for taking time to come into DC to do this today, because it's really what, for I think both of us, started our passion in this space. So my time on Capitol Hill, I do have personal experience with some of these issues, was driven by personal, but also patient advocates and what could you change. And the last job that I had on Capitol Hill was for the former Majority Leader Eric Cantor, where we had just gone through, as Emily said, the Republicans had taken control of the House, and you had split government with President Obama and huge conversations about the deficit and budgets, which, wait a second, we're back there again right now in 2016. But so many of the conversations about the deficit and government were about what programs we were going to cut and how do you reduce spending, all critically important to long-term longevity of programs that people need. But in part of those conversations, Eric really saw that people were losing sight of it's not just about cutting funding, but prioritizing funding, and that we needed to get out of this very negative conversation we were having in the healthcare policy space, because of course at the time everyone was debating healthcare reform, what was the role of the Affordable Care Act, that was not quite that place, obviously very divisive, different viewpoints about the role of that law and its ability to hit some of the goals that were outlined, very partisan debate, partisan passage. So it was very difficult at the time to bring together members from both sides of the aisle onto the same page on a healthcare policy issue. And so working with my former boss and going through this budget process in negotiations with the administration and really noticing that people were sort of saying, well, government can't be involved in healthcare and we need to cut spending, that Eric really saw that there was a different conversation that people needed to have. I think there's absolutely always a conversation about what's the proper role of government in the healthcare space, and that I wish you were seeing playing out more in the presidential debates. There's some, but it's limited. Then the second piece is, it's not just about cutting spending, but where are you prioritizing your spending? Because you're going to spend money. So where's the space that really deserves that priority? And it was a great opportunity, but Eric really tried to change that dynamic before he left office of talking about the space that both parties could come back together, and that was in medical research. That what if you could actually cure some of these diseases that were driving costs? Would that not be a better way to help control long-term spending with the government than some of this piecemeal targeted we call it on Capitol Hill, turn a dial, because everything's always driven. Congressional organization, as you explained, dictates which members have the first say about a policy issue. But the other entity that drives whether or not decisions are made in the spending space is also the Congressional Budget Office. And the way that they analyze legislation and that they score the potential budgetary impacts of that legislation, that drives policy decisions. And you're seeing it play out right now, even though there is a budget deal for the appropriations process. Right now in the House of Representatives, the leadership team wanted to move a budget. They proactively want to move a budget. They proactively want to show what they're going to do to try to get deficits under control. And because the 10-year budget window has shifted, the amount of deficits is larger. And so you have to then put forward new policy proposals to show how you're going to reduce spending. And it's an interesting debate about priorities. And your budget blueprint is a debate about priorities. So with that, you're boxed into the current norm of however the Congressional Budget Office values scoring something. That's what a bill is scored at. And I'm sure many folks in this room have been involved in different issues that seem so obvious from a logical perspective. Well, in the long run, this is going to save money. CBO doesn't always score it that way, and that can really change the movement of a piece of legislation on the Hill. But Eric's drive was, let's start thinking about these in a different way, and it was with great success and focus that the Hill, over this past Congress, has made the issue of cures and what do we need to do to drive innovation and drive better outcomes and quality for patients a top policy issue. It's not always a top policy issue, and that I think is something that personally frustrates me. Why isn't this the conversation that we have every single Congress? Why is it only when a member of Congress decides this is my leadership issue, like Fred Upton did, and now Lamar Alexander on the Senate side with the Healthier America, Innovations for Healthier Americans project? Why is it just a set Congress proposal, or why do we always wait for only when it's the must-pass piece of legislation, like the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, that's required, that we have these conversations that are so fundamental to improving the lives of Americans? Why is that? And that's a longer term problem, and I think as all of us are witnessing with very dynamic, unpredictable presidential election right now for both parties, these are the things that elections decide. But for us on the Hill, I just want you to know that the meetings that you have today really do drive larger conversations behind the scenes with Capitol Hill staff, with their members. And just to sort of throw it back to Emily, personal office is where you start. The committee staff, they help to shape whether or not the chairmen are going to focus on specific spaces. So using energy and commerce as an example, the Cures legislative initiative, the staff that worked on that policy, issues that different groups would raise to them and different companies. I'm thrilled that as a consultant now working off the Hill, that many of the people that I work with, the innovative companies, are the folks that work with you all to help sponsor these events. And really, it is a partnership between patient advocates and the biopharmaceutical industry in trying to figure out, where do we invest? Where do we move? How do we make sure that patients, especially in the rare disease space, know about the clinical trials at the right time and can participate? You know, all of those conversations are much larger than any one person. And I think if you take one thing away from your time here on Capitol Hill, is it's not just one meeting that's 10 minutes. It's a 10-minute meeting that changes thinking, and it really leaves that impact.
Yeah, I completely agree with what Cheryl has said. And now kind of going into a little bit about what you can expect between now and the end of the year. You're here at a really unique time, being, I guess it's now Super Tuesday. So I hope those of you who live in those, 13 states have cast your ballots already absentee. But, it's a really interesting time because with a very, very dynamic federal, national election, and every member of Congress on the House side up for re-election. Some of them are retiring. Some of them are wanting to leave legacies before they go. Some of them are running for Senate, like my member of Congress. Some of them are being challenged either on the left or the right with credible challengers. It's a really, really interesting time. And between now and the end of the year, you have, well, I would not call him yet a lame duck president, but at least November, you'll have that. You've got much more time where members are spending in the districts either campaigning for re-election or working for members who are more vulnerable in their home communities. You have also kind of an interesting dynamic going on with the current chair of the House Energy and Commerce Committee, Chairman Upton. His chairmanship is term limited, so he will return as a member of Congress. He will just no longer be chair of E&C. And Cures, the 21st Century Cures Initiative, which I'm sure you all have heard and lobbied on back home or you will be while you're here. That is his
impressive social media.
And social media, yeah. That is his legacy project. And from what I've seen on the Democratic side, and I'm sure Cheryl can speak to this on the Republican side, this is a tremendous priority for the chairman. And lucky for us, there are a number of incredible provisions in there that really help the rare disease community. In no small part because of the advocacy of our DLA and because of the advocacy of all of you here in this room. And so what I'm seeing is the chairman's willingness to reach across the aisle and reach across chambers and really urging the Senate to try and take this up and move this piece of legislation. My understanding that the less visible side of things is, when senators are calling the congressman, the chairman, and saying, Chairman, I've got a bill before your committee. It's passed the Senate. We just hotlined it. We need the Energy and Commerce Committee to move it. He's like, okay, sure. So what are you going to do for me on cures? And that's a good thing for you all. So when you are doing your Senate meetings, make sure you're very vocal about the importance of cures and the 21st Century Cures Initiative and what it means to you by sharing your personal story. Cheryl, do you want to talk a bit more about kind of what your perspective is on from now through end of the year?
Sure, that's perfect.
And we're watching the clock, so we've got about 2 more minutes.
2 more minutes. So you all are like, all right, so are we going to pass some legislation in the next month? And the honest answer for you is probably not. I think there's going to be a lot of policy conversations, but legislative action will be largely stalled until they figure out how to move through this budget process. Now, it's very clear with the new Speaker Paul Ryan in the House, that appropriations legislation is something that they intend to focus on between now and when they recess in August. I think that's a great opportunity because, as you very accurately said, any member of Congress, if they do indeed move through what is, quote, regular order, open process, can offer an amendment of any type so long as it's germane to the appropriations bill. With an appropriations bill, you can make just about anything germane to the legislation if you draft it just so. So some really creative staffers and members can have a lot of amendments move forward through that appropriations process on these topics. Now, whether or not all of that can be resolved before August, it never has. And so if you're looking at history as a guideline, not likely. So you're largely looking at a very, a period of months of policy conversations, limited action. That's frustrating for y'all working on Cures and the Healthy Americans initiatives, obviously, because there was such momentum on the House on Cures, and now that people feel a stall. And that's for a variety of issues of vast policy disagreements and people also trying to figure out who ultimately is going to be in the White House to help them drive future agendas on these spaces, because there are major philosophical disagreements about what drives innovation in this space. There are many places, and I would say this is still the area that brings the two parties together, but innovation is not just about how much money NIH has or how much money FDA has. There are a series of policy proposals that impact the decisions that the companies that actually produce treatments, and ultimately you want to focus on not just a treatment but a cure, and whether or not they're going to invest in certain spaces. And so the policy space that you're having to work in is huge. It's not just NIH and FDA. It's tax policy. It's patent policy. It's trade policy. It's huge. It's huge, and there are pieces moving in all of those spaces right now. So it's a very exciting time for these policy conversations. But I think post the November election, when we know who will be moving down Pennsylvania Avenue, what the election has played out for a very dynamic Senate election this fall, I think that will really drive the decisions on how do they wrap up in what will be, as most expect, a very active lame duck session for the Congress, as well as the Obama administration on some of these policy issues. And I fundamentally believe, having watched this current administration, that the administration will take some executive actions, as they have in other policy spaces, on some issues. And the questions are, which executive actions? And depending on what happens with the election, how is Congress going to respond to those executive actions, and what is going to be the role of the next president in either seeing those through or pushing forward with new legislation pending whether or not the Cures package, which was one package in the House, but is now moving as very targeted policy proposals in the Senate, how those all come together. And the last note I would say, and I know we've now exceeded, is that your meetings matter, congressional organization matters, but the things that you can't really control, but you can definitely influence, are when there's willing leadership to focus on an issue, the timing of those issues, and also don't get caught up in things that sound good but don't have meaningful change. And it is good to raise attention about issues, but you have such focus right now on the Hill on policies that are actual meaningful changes. I think that is a great place to be in, where we just don't do policy proposals that just raise awareness, but we're actually trying to move policy proposals that change the projection. And again, I just want to say it's been a privilege and honor to be here. Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you, ladies.